These four old friends, Tony, Pete, Jake, and Marty, gathered for their weekly poker game at Pete's house. There is thick wee and friendly banter as they shuffle their chips and deal the first hand. But tonight, something feels off. Their usual fifth player, Norman, is absent. In his place sits a stranger, Nick, a grinning, unsettling man who claims he was invited in Norman's stead. The friends, though puzzled, welcome him with open arms. After all, it's just poker, right? The men joke and rib each other as they deal the cards. But as the game unfolds, small oddities begin to surface. When Nick wins again, Peter, the most frustrated of the bunch, notices the eerie combination, triple sixes. With growing unease, he asks him about his identity and whom he replaced again. Nick says his cousin, Norman. Pete is not totally convinced. Tony says they should play a different game, like baseball. But Jake objects. As usual, Marty is not familiar with a new game, but Tony being the dealer, they have to follow his choice of game. Jake leaves the room to go get a beer, but to his dismay, there's no more beer, and he berates Pete for not stocking enough beer for game night. Pete says he drank some in the afternoon and apologizes, but Jake won't let it go. The next few rounds are no better. Nick keeps winning, and every time there's a six involved. Pete's paranoia deepens, but Marty makes a joke, which is not funny. Nick asks Pete about his wife, and Tony tells him Pete doesn't like to talk about her as he doesn't like his wife very much. When Nick wins again with another six combo, Pete have had enough. He quips, "That's a hell lot of sixes for one guy. It can't just all be luck." Nick chuckles and says he hasn't even noticed. The three friends discuss Nick's peculiar sixes winning streak when he goes for water. Pete says something ain't right. Jake says he noticed that every hand he'd won has had a six. And Tony agrees. Pete says it's not normal, and that means it can only be one thing. Nick is the devil. Jake wants to be sure first before accusing Nick. But Tony, a stickler for rules, still wants to protect the integrity of the game, but he gives in eventually. They find that Nick's next set is another triple six. They are terrified now, but Tony, ever the reasonable one, says they should remain calm. They start wondering why the devil is in their mix. Pete wants to call Norman and ask him, but Jake says they all know why the devil goes anywhere. He's come to take one of them. The real question is who? They start to put it on one another as Nick comes back in. He notices the unease among them and asks them. They tell him they called Norman, but he's not home like he said. Nick says Norman is out visiting his sick uncle, then looks at his watch and says he just died, confirming he is indeed the devil. Bizarrely, they berate him for not revealing himself sooner. He says he didn't say anything earlier as he didn't want to spoil the game. He tells them they can keep the money as conciliatory, that they need it more than him, except for one person, of course. Pete fretfully asks whom, but Nick asks them to guess, further increasing their misery. Jake throws caution to the wind and calls him a jerk. Each of them tries to make a case for himself and why he should pick another person. Nick says they should play for it. Each will pick a card, and the highest card wins. In this case, loses. He asks Tony to go first, but he says, "What about Marty, who has not yet returned from his washroom break?" Nick says Marty would pick a low card. He's the type that's too innocent to corrupt, unlike the three of them. Tony picks an 8 of hearts. Much to his relief, Jake draws a 7 of spades, and Pete, you guessed it, draws the highest card, Jack of spades. Nick asks Pete to follow him as Tony and Jake awkwardly try to excuse themselves. Pete says the game was rigged, and they insist Pete be given a chance to fight for his soul. Nick reluctantly agrees to play a winner-takes-all one-on-one game with Pete. Tony says Nick must bet something if Pete is putting his soul on the line. Nick puts in $18, which they deduce. It's a multiple of 6. They forced him to bet 19. As the dealer, Pete picks a low ball. The lowest hand with few or no matching cards wins, as opposed to high hand in regular poker, which is a disadvantage to Nick the Devil, who has been drawing 6s all night. Nick loses his cool for the first time in the night. Marty rejoins the group as the game starts, and is confused as usual. As they continue the game, Nick the Devil is drawing his 6s, but Pete is also drawing 5s. His last hope of saving his soul is disappearing. But Tony still has hope. He tries to explain that Pete can still win if the Devils draws a 4th 6, but Jake thinks the odds are next to impossible, as the Devil has not drawn a 4 6s thus far. Nick turns his card and is a death card. Pete loses. He must cede his soul to Nick the Devil. But novice Marty says he doesn't get it. Nick is not fast enough to stop him from touching the card. And it turns out the devil tricked them. He magically camouflaged a 6 in order to win. But for Marty's innocence, it would have worked. They rebuked him for cheating, but Nick says he couldn't help himself. Did they forget he is the devil? As a peace offering, he mystically provides them food and drinks and tells them to never say, the devil is not a generous man. Before leaving, he suggests that he should host the next game, and that he will make sure that each one of them is invited. The episode ends with the friends enjoying themselves with the food Nick the Devil provided, seemingly forgetting the moribund situation they just had. Thank you for watching. Like and subscribe for more classic movie recaps.